9. SS Airfield. The SS Airfield is found in Australia's Homebush Bay. Homebush Bay was once a bustling port with many small businesses and industries lining the water's shores, sending their trade out through freighters in the docks. Although the area has seen a breath of new life over the past 20 years, thanks to the 2000 Sydney Olympics, there are still 4 rustling historic remnants of the area's industrial past floating in the nearby waters. Left to rust where they were anchored, 4 ships are abandoned here, but one of these shipwrecks stands out above the rest. The SS Airfield has a whole grove of mangrove trees covering its upper deck, turning it into a real floating forest. The ship was built in 1911, so it's over 110 years old. With the sheer amount of trees that have taken over, it's a mystery how it stays afloat. It's unknown how long the SS Airfield can keep carrying on above the water as the tree roots dig into its hull. But for now, it remains the fanciest orchard on the high seas. 8. HMS Endurance. Some amazing shipwrecks are in remarkable condition for their age, even the ones made out of wood. The HMS Endurance was a ship used by explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton while he explored the icy regions of Antarctica, but the vessel got stuck in the dense ice of Antarctica's Weddell Sea in 1915, slowly sinking beneath the waves while Shackleton and his men looked on. What happened next is one of the most impressive survival stories ever, as the explorer and his crew braved deadly conditions to reach safety. The wreck of the HMS Endurance remained undiscovered until 2022, over 100 years after it first sank. It was found by the Endurance 22 expedition, and the crew was amazed by what they saw. Despite sitting on the bottom of the sea for over a century, the Endurance was perfectly preserved, as if the vessel had been frozen still in time. The wood was pretty much intact, and they could even see the gold lettering of the ship's name painted on the stern. The reason the boat has stayed in such remarkable condition is because of where it sank. Due to the icy temperatures of the water, wood-eating bacteria and sea creatures simply can't survive in the environment. That doesn't mean the wreck of the Endurance is devoid of life, though. Many anemones, sea sponges, and marine creatures now call Shackleton's infamous ship their new home. 7. Sweepstakes. Sweepstakes was a double-masted wooden schooner built in 1867 in Ontario, Canada. In August 1885, the 119-foot-long ship was transporting coal when it sustained damage while sailing past Cove Island. Still afloat despite the damage she received, Sweepstakes was towed to the safety of Big Tub Harbor in Tobermory by a tugboat named Jessie. But when she reached the top of the harbor, it was clear the damage to Sweepstakes was substantial. Try as they might to repair the ship, in the end, it was a losing battle, and Sweepstakes sank to the bottom of the harbor in September that year. Although we don't know what happened to her crew, we do know they were able to salvage all of the coal Sweepstakes was carrying from the wreck. Almost 140 years later, you don't even need to dive in order to see the Sweepstakes in its final resting place. She lies in such shallow, clear water that you can see her from standing on the surface. But if you do take the plunge and dive down 20 feet, you'll realize that she's in great shape for her age. The vessel is pretty much still in one piece, although she has lost her masts. You can still see the entire hull, deck, windlass, and even some of the railings on her sides. For those who feel a little bit more brave, you can even swim into Sweepstakes' hold and take a look inside. 6. Iron Scow. The Iron Scow sits on top of the famous U.S. natural landmark, Niagara Falls. The iron-hulled vessel sits close to the edge of the massive waterfall, almost as if it's poised there for some sort of a stunt in a movie. As for how it got there, we need to go back over 100 years to 1918. On August 6th, a dumping scow was attached to a towboat, with 2 men working on board the tiny boat. For some reason, the scow broke free from its tethers and floated rapidly downstream thanks to the strong currents of the Niagara River. Amazingly, instead of plunging over the waterfall, the Iron Scow managed to stop just short of the edge. It lodged tight onto some rocks in the rapids right before the falls, and remained there for 101 years, stuck in place and time. That was until October 31st, 2019. A strong weather front blew in, bringing heavy winds and rain. The iron scow dislodged from its century-long resting place and started to coast towards the edge of Niagara once again, as people wondered whether the boat would finally plunge over the top for good. But the scow stopped short and remains at the top of these famous falls. Now the debate rests on if or when it will finally make its last journey down Niagara for good. What do you think will happen to the iron scow? Let us know in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. 5. HMS Vixen. HMS Vixen was built in 1865 and was a trailblazer for her time. Commissioned by Britain, she was a composite armored gunboat and one of the only of her kind. If that wasn't enough, HMS Vixen was also the first vessel used by the British Royal Navy that had twin propellers to help push her through the waves. Made with a skeleton of iron and covered with a layer of strong teak wood up to 5.5 inches, her 4 steam engines gave her 740 horsepower. The same strength as some sports cars today. But she wasn't going anywhere in a hurry, since she only had a top speed of 8.9 knots, the equivalent of 10 miles per hour. Despite the technological features that made her one of a kind, the Vixen proved she was not exactly suited to open sea sailing. She and another ship, HMS Viper, were towed across the Atlantic Ocean in 1868 to Bermuda, where they would act as defensive ships for the Royal Navy dockyard. HMS Vixen had many tough scrapes with weather. In 1873, she lost all of her masts, rigging, and equipment from her upper deck. Just 3 years later, in 1876, she nearly sank in the Irish Channel, with damage so severe she would no longer be able to operate in open sea. In 1878, a hurricane swept over Bermuda, causing massive damage to many ships and the floating dock. HMS Vixen managed to survive this, thanks to the removal of her masts and deck equipment 5 years before. By 1895, HMS Vixen had outlived her use as a defensive ship and was being used to house dockyard laborers as a floating bunkhouse. That same year, she was set to be sold, but HMS Vixen's end came in 1896. 1 year later, she was purposefully sunk using scuttling charges in order to become a blockade for a water channel around David's Head in Bermuda. Nowadays, she lies in a gap in the coral reef with her bow poking out over the waves, fascinating historians and tourists. 4. Hermes. The Hermes was a U.S. Navy ship built in 1943. She measured 165 feet and was pretty small. She was special considering the way she was built and has a unique layout, unlike any other vessel. The cargo hold of Hermes was in the front part of the ship. Her mast was also near the prow, being right in front of the wheelhouse. As a result of this, a cargo boom could be attached to the mast, allowing the ship to pick up floating navigation buoys and drop them into the hold. Hermes was heading towards Cape Verde with her crew in the 1980s, when she started having engine trouble near Bermuda. Although her crew stayed on for a while, eventually they left the boat stranded when it became clear the repair costs were not justifiable. Hermes was eventually put up for sale. By 1985, no buyers were interested in the ship, so the government of Bermuda made the decision the vessel would be handed over to the Bermuda Divers Association to be made into an artificial reef. On May 15, 1985, Hermes was scuttled off of Horseshoe Bay. This unwanted wreck is now one of the most popular diving spots in all of Bermuda. 3. The Vasa. One of the most advanced warships of the 17th century was also very short-lived. Vasa was a Swedish warship classed as the biggest Navy achievement at the time. The vessel was truly a sight to behold, and historians have even called it the most spectacular warship ever built. It was finished in 1628 and has beautiful wooden carvings on its hull that tell the history of the Swedish royal family. Commissioned by the king, Gustav II Adolf himself, Vasa also boasted 64 bronze cannons, the most that had ever been carried by a warship during the time. As you can imagine, the maiden voyage of Vasa was a grand and talked about affair. Many members of the public gathered to watch it set sail, on August 10, 1628, including the royal family. But the show they had all gathered to see was completely different from the one that unfolded. Just 20 minutes into its departure from Stockholm Harbor, a fierce gust of wind struck the Vasa. The warship was able to withstand the first gust, but then a second hit. The Vasa immediately started to sink as its adoring public could only watch in horror. There have been many debates over the years on what led to the Vasa's swift demise. Some believe it was due to its rushed construction, and others think the gun deck was weighed down too much by all of the cannons. Vasa stayed at the bottom of the Baltic Sea until 1961, when she was painstakingly raised from the seabed. Remarkably, the ship was fairly well preserved due to the cold waters she rested in. Today, she finds her home in the Vasa Museum, which was named after her and is the only preserved example of a 17th century ship found anywhere in the world. 2. Melkmaid. In October 1659, a Dutch merchant ship named Melkmaid, which translates to milkmaid, finished loading its hold in Iceland with valuable cargo to take back to Amsterdam and sell. As they passed by Flatey Island, a storm started to brew. Instead of pushing through and sailing in the rough weather, the crew instead decided to lay anchor and wait until the storm passed. Unfortunately, this did not work as they hoped. Over the next 2 days, the 15-man crew desperately tried to stop the ship from sinking, but nothing they did could stop Melkmaid from falling beneath the waves, losing a member in the process. The remaining 14 crew managed to make their way to Flatey Island. Due to winter settling in, they spent the next few months there until more forgiving weather came, thousands of miles away from their homeland. As for Melkmaid, she would lay at the bottom of the sea for centuries, until she was uncovered by 2 divers in 1992. The following year, a scientific expedition took place, and in 2016, another study was carried out. Not only is Melkmaid the oldest shipwreck in Icelandic waters, but it is also an archaeological site of significance, thanks to the artifacts found on board, like pottery and other fine goods destined for Dutch markets. 1. MS World Discoverer. Laying on its side in shallow waters off the Solomon Islands coast is the MS World Discoverer. This cruise ship was built in 1974 and was used by a few cruise liner companies here and there, like Biwa Cruises and Adventure Cruises. The ship traveled around the world, taking many passengers with her on her journeys. She faithfully served travelers for over 25 years, until April 2000, when everything went wrong. The Discoverer was sailing past the Solomon Islands when bad weather started to come in. Normally, this would not be a problem, but the strong waves and currents steered the liner into a coral reef. Stranded, her captain, Oliver Crewis, radioed help for the crew and passengers on board. Thankfully, he got a response, and local ferries grouped together to get everyone on board to safety. With everyone now off the ship, Captain Crewis managed to limp the MS World Explorer further inland into Roderick Bay, where she now sits leaning on her side. Over time, she has started to deteriorate, and much of what may have been valuable on her decks has been taken by looters. But MS World Explorer still draws the attention of tourists and photographers looking to get a snapshot of this historic shipwreck. 6. Rio Shipwreck. The Black Sea was experiencing a pattern of storms in December 2018. When one of the massive storms hit, the crew of a cargo ship named Rio was navigating the seas. Calls for help were made to the nearby port of Novorossiysk, but the rescue effort was unsuccessful because of the severe weather. The crew's only other choice was to run the ship aground in order to avoid more damage. Near Kabardinka, the crew practically docked the ship into a sandy cove. The crew's lives were saved, and there was no more damage to the ship. The boat was securely planted in the sand, and since it was immobile, it remained there. The owner of the ship intends to recover the wreck and eventually take it back to sea. A lot of people have been drawn to the unique site, which has elevated Kabardinka to fame and increased tourism. People go to great distances just to see the wreckage. 5. The Shipwrecks at Land's End. The small entrance to San Francisco Bay has ideal circumstances for shipwrecks, thanks to its dense fog, powerful tides, and hazardous rocks right underneath the water's surface. International shipping supported San Francisco's thriving economy through the gold rush era. Until the turn of the 20th century, over 300 ships met their end in the dangerous waters of this shipping channel. The SS city of Rio de Janeiro was by far the worst and expensive of these tragic accidents. She got to the Mile Rock during dense fog on February 22, 1901, while traveling from Hong Kong to San Francisco through the Golden Gate. Of the 210 people on board, including the captain, William Ward, she lost about 130 within 8 minutes of sinking. The 82 survivors clung to debris until an Italian fisherman came to help. After the disaster, bodies washed up at Fort Point for many years. The construction of Mile Rock Light, a lighthouse built to prevent more accidents in the tight strait, was motivated by this heavy loss. 3 ships, the Ohioan, Lehman Stewart, and Frank Buck, are now visible from Land's End. On October 8, 1936, early in the morning, the SS Ohioan, a cargo ship owned by the American Hawaiian Steamship Company, came aground near Seal Rock. The crew remained on board in the hope that high tide would eventually release the ship as the thick fog cleared and the Coast Guard tried to rescue the harbor pilot. A crowd gathered to watch as attempts were made to save the ship over the next few days, but none were effective. Both the Frank Buck and the Lehman Stewart were tankers built at the same shipyard and sank in the same channel. Frank Buck joined Lehman Stewart in 1937 after she ran aground in 1922. Although the engines of both ships were destroyed by explosives in 1938, they're still pretty visible during low tide. 4. USS Arizona. On December 7, 1941, at about 8 in the morning, the crew of the USS Arizona were just starting their day when it was docked at Quay F7 on Battleship Row. The crew had no idea that torpedo bombers were about to launch an attack. The Oklahoma, West Virginia, and repair ship Vestal were among the ships struck, but the USS Arizona suffered the greatest number of casualties from the strikes. The bombs made one of these hits close to gun turret 2, and within seconds it had struck the first and second decks before stopping at the third and detonating. The boat sank to the bottom of the ocean and soon turned into a firestorm, covered by smoke and flames. The explosion's fire consumed 4,600 tons, or 4,173 metric tons, of gasoline over the next 2 days. On board the USS Arizona, there were nearly 1,700 soldiers. Many plunged into the murky water in an attempt to live. In the end, all of them died by flame or water, and the attack on the USS Arizona is still one of the deadliest naval catastrophes in U.S. history. The USS Arizona was built with enormous ambition. Its name symbolized Arizona becoming the 48th state of the Union in 1912, and the ship's construction only took 15 months. It was a 608-foot-long, or 185 meters, $13 million ship with torpedo tubes and 14-inch cannons that had a peak speed of nearly 21 knots. It was one of the most dangerous battleships in existence. The ship's ability to carry 1.5 million gallons, or 5.6 million liters of fuel, and run on gasoline instead of coal astounded everyone at the time. But regrettably, this was more of a barrier than an advantage. The USS Arizona had its inaugural voyage to the Caribbean after its construction was finished, despite the fact that the ship's engines still had issues that were later resolved after returning to New York. The ship was taken to Chesapeake Bay, where it was moored. Even though the U.S. was preparing to enter World War I, the ship was later sent to Pearl Harbor in 1940, where it served until 1941. The vessel's weapons and turrets were removed after the attack on Pearl Harbor and reused, but the actual ship could not be fully saved. As a result, the USS Arizona Memorial now stands on top of it. Even now, oil seeping from its hull serves as a reminder of how violent the event was 75 years ago. Have you ever been to Pearl Harbor? Tell us in the comments and hit the subscribe button while you're at it. 3. The almost ships. The Imperial Japanese Navy tried to scare the United States with their huge Yamato-class battleship. As tensions rose in the Pacific during the lead-up to the war, the Second London Naval Treaty, which Japan refused to sign, was allegedly breached by battery arrangements. The Yamato-class battleship was viewed as a significant danger in the Pacific by Britain, France, and the United States, who invoked the escalator clause to allow an increase in the size and weaponry of their major vessels. The US began developing the Montana-class battleships quite quickly. But as the Pacific War progressed, this huge battleship lost its importance. This led to the cancellation of 5 more ships before they were even built. But as history has proven, wrecking these vessels wasn't a huge loss for the Americans. Aircraft carriers have already started to play a more significant part in modern naval combat. The battleship Montana, a successor to the Iowa class, was designed to have 4 turrets with 3 guns each, and 12 16-inch, 40.6 centimeter Mark 7 cannons installed on them. This was an improvement over the 3x3, 16-inch, 40.6 centimeter gun arrangement used in the Iowa. The objective of the Montana classes was to create a battleship that could compete with Japan's Yamato while also being slower, stronger, and more heavily armored. The US Navy was able to build the most heavily equipped battleship in its history, without the Second London Naval Treaty's restrictions. But before construction could begin, the United States was dealt a devastating blow that drastically changed its plans. The attack on Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japanese Navy on December 7, 1941, forced the US to join the war. American military strategists had to make a major decision. They had to decide whether to keep working on the Montana class, which wouldn't be ready for a few more years, or stop and concentrate on other battleships. The decision was made to cancel the Montana class. A catastrophic move by the Empire of Japan caused the construction of the USS Montana, BB-67, USS Ohio, BB-68, USS Maine, BB-69, USS New Hampshire, BB-70, and USS Louisiana, BB-71, to be completely canceled on July 21, 1943. The attack on Pearl Harbor almost destroyed the US's Pacific Fleet, but the US Navy recovered much more quickly than anybody thought they could. And as they did, a new kind of battleship came onto the scene. The Americans came to understand the effectiveness of their aircraft carriers by the middle of 1942, after the Battle of Midway. The carrier-led force was able to significantly harm Japan's own fleet despite lacking the bigger, more powerful ships. The Battle of Midway changed the course of the war and contributed to the Allies' victory in the Pacific. It also helped the idea that battleships were no longer as valuable as they once were. The Iowa-class fast battleships and Essex-class aircraft carriers, which were already under construction, were given precedence over the Montana-class battleships. The era of battleship passed, and the aircraft carrier's rise began. 2. Ghost Fleet. A fleet of wooden steamships was built in shipyards around the country in order to support the war effort against Germany during World War I. Birds now built nests on the boats, and bats raised their young inside the hulls. In the Potomac River at Mallows Bay, Maryland, there are still more than 100 old ships providing a semi-submerged habitat for fish, beavers, waterfowl, and more. The first National Marine Sanctuary designation in over 2 decades was made by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in July 2019 for this 18-square-mile area, or 46 square kilometers. Along with shipwrecks from the Civil War and the Ghost Fleet of World War I, the Mallows Bay Potomac River National Marine Sanctuary also has Native American archaeological sites dating back almost 12,000 years. The U.S. Emergency Fleet Corporation was established by President Woodrow Wilson in 1916, and it immediately began building hundreds of ships to counter the German U-boats as they sank passenger and cargo ships in the Atlantic. During the war, none of the ships actually made it to Europe thanks to technical and construction problems. The majority of them were hauled along the Potomac to be rescued by nearby businesses, which eventually just dumped them at Mallows Bay. In an effort to promote tourism, educational activities, and new jobs, public officials and environmentalists in Maryland proposed the spot in 2014. It sought to gain federal funding and boost site monitoring. The nomination was put on hold while waiting for the governor's approval because of strong opposition from people who relied on the Potomac for their livelihood. They were concerned that more rules would harm their industry and lives. Mallows Bay offers kayakers the chance to explore shipwrecks and see a variety of animals, including bald eagles and osprey birds. The best shipwreck diving spots on the planet can be found at this spot. 430 wrecks and airplanes are protected by the National Marine Sanctuary System, which consists of 13 sanctuaries and 2 marine national monuments. The last location to get a NOAA designation in 2000 was the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary and Underwater Preserve. Then, until NOAA could verify that it had enough resources to maintain its existing inventory, Congress put a hold on any more sanctuaries. 1. Gold Rush ships. Under the city of San Francisco, California, there is a large ship graveyard. In the middle of the 19th century, during the gold rush, these ships were built. Many of them, carrying gold prospectors, were simply abandoned in the harbor instead of being sent back to their ports. The ships were covered by construction, and as time passed, they were largely forgotten. But some of them have since been uncovered and brought back into the public eye thanks to the laying of new building foundations or the construction of tunnels under the city. San Francisco was a town of little significance throughout the first half of the 19th century. Due to Mexico's loss in the Mexican-American War, the small community joined the United States of America in 1848. The gold rush started the next year after James W. Marshall allegedly found gold somewhere in Coloma, California. As a result, prospectors were drawn in droves to the state, and San Francisco quickly expanded into a city with tens of thousands of residents. For those looking to participate in the gold rush, there were only 2 options. One path was by land, and the other was by sea. The former was the shorter of the routes, but the second option was the faster, assuming you were starting your voyage from the East Coast. The bulk of prospectors chose to travel by water, which may not come as a surprise to some. Many of these ships were left in the harbor after reaching San Francisco. Some of the owners purposefully dispatched them on their final voyage to San Francisco, even though they were, in some cases, too run down to make the trip back to the ports they originally left from. Other times, crew members, including sailors and officers, left the ships in search of gold. The number of abandoned ships increased until it reached almost 1,000, filling the harbor. Other ships had to be anchored in deeper seas farther from the shore because of this. Porters were also required since products had to be moved over the shallows. Hiring porters cost a lot of money, which decreased merchant earnings. The decision was made by city officials to resolve this issue by bringing the shoreline closer to the deeper waters. They intended to sell waterfront properties, bundled with the requirement that owners finish their own land reclamation. One factor that contributed to the success of this move was the fact that, as San Francisco's population increased, so did the need for land. The shoreline of the city moved deeper into the bay as a result of land reclamation. Some of the abandoned ships were submerged beneath landfills as a result of this process. As these ships are being rediscovered, their locations are documented, and up to 60 of them have been identified so far. But given the number of ships said to have been abandoned in the port during the gold rush, it's possible that there are still many more buried beneath the city's surface.
Number 4. World War II plane wreck, Jake Seaplane. The Republic of Palau is an island country located in the Western Pacific. The nation consists of roughly 340 islands and has a total land area of about 180 square miles. Today, Palau is mostly known for its exquisite scenery and world-famous shark diving. But during World War II, the island played an extremely important role. The war over predominance in the area between the Japanese and the Americans was mostly fought in the air, but Palau was situated in the perfect location to protect the regions in Southeast Asia that were already occupied. The Japanese forces were swiftly defeated by the more powerful U.S. Air Force, and as a result, their supply ships were left unprotected and open to being attacked from above. In order to completely neutralize the enemy threat, the Americans ordered a series of airstrikes on the vulnerable Japanese fleet. In the midst of the attack, the over 60 ships were sunk off the coast of Palau. Numerous planes from both sides were shot down and were consequently lost at sea. One of the most notable plane wrecks that can be found here is the famous Jake seaplane. The wreck was first discovered in 1994 by a fisherman who noticed the plane's metallic remains from the surface. The plane sits upright on top of a coral head underneath about 49 feet of water. The Jake was the Japanese Navy seaplane believed to be one of the aircrafts that was shot down during the conflict in the skies above Palau. The aircraft is approximately 36 feet long, with a wingspan stretching almost 50 feet. It served as a slow-moving reconnaissance plane and also was given the code name Jake by the Allies. Because it's been underwater for so long, it's almost entirely overgrown with marine life. While most of the craft is intact, part of the wing pontoon as well as the tail section of the plane has completely detached from the rest of the structure, but the pieces can be found just a short distance away. The engine has also dislodged itself and now rests on the seafloor nearby. The World War II aeroplane serves as a reminder of the brutal conflict between the Japanese and the Americans. And over the years, this wreck has become a rather popular dive site for tourists and adventurous history buffs. The Jake is fairly easy to get to for new divers and is surrounded by a variety of coral, such as staghorn, lettuce, brain, and table corals. The underwater scene is also a perfect place to take pictures since there are no major currents in the area. Number 3. The ancient city of Dorka. The ancient city of Dorka is recognized in Hindu culture as the beautiful city of Krishna. According to Hindu writings, Krishna, the god of compassion, protection, and love, left Earth in order to become one with the spirit world. Once the deity was gone, the age of Kali began, and the city of Dorka and all of its inhabitants were supposedly buried beneath the sea. However, many interpret this legend to be the story of a tsunami that wiped out an entire civilization, similar to the one that struck India in 2004. Unlike the legend, some parts of the city survived the natural disaster and they remain sacred Hindu towns today. But since the 1930s, excavations have been carried out in order to find the lost sections of Dorka. Between 1983 and 1990, archaeologists uncovered a fortified foundation beneath the waters of the Arabian Sea. They believe this to be the location that the ancient city walls were once built along the banks of the river. Among the rubble, they also found pillars, stone blocks used for construction, and evidence of irrigation systems. It's still up for debate at the moment, but researchers believe that these vestiges were created between 3000 and 1500 BC. Several anchors made of stone were discovered in the area as well, at the same depth of about 20 feet. This suggests that the submerged part of the city was once involved in trade between Indian and Arabic regions throughout the 15th and 18th centuries. If this is true, Dorka was almost certainly an important trading port in the distant past. Carrying out excavations in this part of the sea is extremely difficult and is only possible between November and February, which is during low tide. The sea has to be calm and ample sunlight is required so the divers can effectively see what's in front of them. This leaves only 40 to 45 possible diving days for researchers each season. Because of this, teams with the Marine Archaeological Unit of the Archaeological Survey of India began to use echo sounding in order to get an accurate depth of objects they discovered under the water. The team, led by Dr. S.R. Rao, one of the most renowned archaeologists in India, conducted various excavations on this site after it was first discovered back in 1963. However, the fortified foundation was not unearthed by them until the late 1980s. Research fizzled for quite some time, but several years later in 2007, the Underwater Archaeology Wing of the ASI started to study the lost city of Dorka once again. This time around, they found underwater structures below the Arabian Sea. However, Alok Tripathi with the UAW was hesitant to describe them as remnants of a temple or a wall because there wasn't much left of them. But the most fascinating finds came in 2001, when National Institute of Oceanography students were commissioned by the government of India to complete a survey on pollution in the Gulf of Kambat, several miles from the shore. During this survey, the students found stone buildings covered in sand and mud along a stretch of 5 square miles. The divers collected samples from the structures, and they also discovered copper coins from the site which had been dated to roughly 3,600 years old. Some of the samples were carbon dated by Manipur and Oxford University, which estimated some of the objects to be around 9,000 years old. The researchers concluded that what they unearthed was an underwater archaeological site that was likely constructed around 7500 BC, which makes this area under the Gulf of Cambodge one of the oldest sites of civilization found anywhere on the planet. The relics and structures uncovered by these marine expeditions were scattered randomly over a vast area along the seafloor, suggesting they have been submerged for a long time. They've likely been carried further and further away from where they originally fell over the years by strong underwater currents. But it's widely believed that the remains have been discovered in this area belong to the lost city of Dorka, the alleged dwelling place of the legendary Krishna from Hindu mythology. What's the craziest thing you've ever found underwater? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. At number 2, Mediterranean Sea Monster. In 2017, a deep-sea diver working in the oil and gas industry stumbled across the skeleton of a mysterious 100-foot-long sea monster at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. The discovery was completely random for the unnamed diver. They had been piloting a remote-operated vehicle at a depth of about 2,723 feet beneath the surface when they noticed the giant skeleton resting on the seafloor. The oil worker was unable to identify the creature, so they sent the video they had recorded of the sea monster to Deborah Hatswell, a paranormal investigator. In the recording of the deep-sea encounter, the diver tries to grab onto one of the vertebrae of the skeleton, but it's so brittle that even the slightest touch turns the bone to dust. The vertebral column of the sea monster was discovered lying in an almost perfectly straight line. Towards the end of the skeleton, there was another set of larger bones which appeared to be the animal's pelvis. When Hatswell received the diver's footage, she was shocked because she was unable to identify the species. In an interview with the Daily Star, Hatswell explained that the dimensions of the skeleton do not fit with the usual size for sea life in the area. Most of the marine animals she compared the remains to were nowhere near the same size. She ruled out the possibility of the creature being a whale because of the features on the skeleton's vertebrae do not match what you'd usually find in the remains of a whale. The sea monster couldn't have been an oarfish either, since they're only known to grow to a maximum of 26 feet. The deep-sea diver who first recorded this giant skeleton believes that based on their past discoveries, this creature could have far more ancient origins. After Deborah posted the clip of the sea monster on her own YouTube channel, she was flooded with comments from those trying to identify it. Some speculated that the skeleton could belong to a Tylosaurus, a huge predatory marine reptile that lived during the late Cretaceous period, roughly 85 million years ago. Others offered more mundane explanations, saying it could just be the decomposed remains of a large hammerhead shark. However, to this day, no one has been able to accurately identify the exact species of the skeleton. The bones were far too fragile to bring back to the surface for any type of thorough investigation. It seems like this is a mystery that will remain unsolved. Whatever the giant creature is, it serves as a reminder that over 80% of the Earth's oceans are still unexplored, and there may just be more mysteries waiting in the deepest parts of the sea, waiting to be discovered. And at number 1, underwater rivers. Hidden far beneath the surface of the Black Sea, there are underwater rivers made of sediment that flow thousands of miles from land. The existence of these rivers were discovered in the late 1980s, when researchers used sonar mapping to get a clearer picture of the seafloor. These mysterious rivers were quite an astonishing revelation at the time, since nothing like them had ever been found or even thought of beforehand. The river below the Black Sea cascades through steep underwater gorges, and they churn around secluded rock towers before traveling across a boundless plain beyond. This deep-sea marvel can be compared to the Colorado River, which carved out the famous Grand Canyon in Arizona. However, this fascinating natural wonder has never been visited by tourists, and you won't find it on any map because it's situated 2 miles below the surface of the ocean. Over millions of years, the Monterey Canyon in California has slowly been shaped by one of these amazing undersea rivers. Just past the mouth of the canyon, a valley has been carved into the seafloor by the flow of the sediment. This valley extends for almost 200 miles before it spills out onto the bottom of the deep ocean. Surprisingly, channels like this one can be found etched into seabeds all over the globe. Since the initial discovery of these rivers in the 1980s, others have been identified in the Amazon, off the coasts of Greenland, and in the Congo and Bengal regions as well. The largest underwater rivers stretch thousands of miles into the ocean and are typically several miles wide. In most instances, they provide important sustenance to the marine creatures living nearby. In a lot of ways, underwater rivers are very similar to the rivers we find on land. Those found beneath the surface still have banks on each side of them, and most of the time, smaller rivers feed into larger ones. They still shape the area around them, and they can even change course, which results in certain sections of the river being abandoned. And just like land rivers eventually spill into the ocean, underwater rivers flow into the abysmal plain in the deepest parts of the sea. Instead of fresh water or salt water, these rivers are filled with slurries of sand and silt, which cascades through deep channels along the seafloor. Each individual particle travels through the water under its own weight. Once an underwater river begins to form on the continental shelf, much like an avalanche, the sediment picks up speed over time and slowly gains momentum until it's flowing like a liquid. Unfortunately, learning about these rivers has proven extremely difficult for researchers given their immense depth. According to sedimentologist Dan Parsons from the University of Hull in the UK, compared to what we know about rivers that are found on land, we practically have no accurate measurements of the flowing rivers under the sea. The only effective way to study them is by specialized remote-controlled deep-sea submarines. And what makes research even more difficult is that these rivers don't flow all the time. Apparently, they can be inactive for years once a flow has passed. Another reason that not much else is known about these rivers is due to the expensive cost of utilizing the underwater research vessels. Just one day of use can cost upwards of $25,000. And so, instead of exploring the actual underwater rivers, many researchers mostly rely on computer-generated simulations. Would you rather discover a lost civilization submerged under the water, or discover a new species that you get to name whatever you'd like? Let us know what you think in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.